America is facing a seismic shift, and to get the stories behind the noise, the media sound bites, social media, and big data, we spoke with a cross-section of Americans in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Based on what we heard, if we're to unite this nation, we're going to need to foster change from the bottom up, together. No one is coming to save us. As part of our journey to better understand who we really are as a people, we learned a lot about how our powerful institutions beyond government will need to use their power to make life better for us.
So we're in a period right now, kind of a 10 to 15, maybe even 20-year period where we're seeing more value change happen faster than we have seen since the 1960s. Around same-sex marriage, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, monuments, and you just don't see value change that big occur that rapidly very often. And so that's why I think this is a unique moment in time. People are paying much more attention to things that go on in society at large. I generally talk about this in a marketing context. So my little history of the world since 1900 is sort of a marketing history. First half of the 20th century was the product era. It was all about stuff. The second half of the 20th century was the person era. It was all about the person buying the product, personalization. Now we're in a century where it's all about the public, and it's all about brands and companies going beyond kind of shareholder value, if you will, to a broader sense of stakeholder value, to the ways in which they can contribute to a better society. The spark for this was sustainability, but now we're in a moment that combines the pandemic and the protest movements, and companies are finding themselves in a position where there are greater and greater expectations that they will contribute to a better society.
What I think about brands now, and I've seen research on this topic, but brands are more trusted than government. Right now, government is seeming to be more confused, and people, I think, are looking for direction and, advice and input and clarity. Certainly, there are parts of government and governors and local mayors who have stepped up with real leadership and clarity. So it's not just across the board. But in general, I think there's quite a lot of confusion from government and not the kind of direction people expect. On the other hand, I think if brands and businesses do this well-run brands typically do have strong leaders. They typically do have a purpose and values, and they do often work on clarity of communications. But historically, brands have just done that with their customers in their world, in their base. But I think more are stepping up now to make that statement and fill in the void. So there are great leaders in great businesses and brands that can play on a bigger platform now. And it's not just playing on the platform, it's really being, who they are in a bigger world than their brand.
Ben & Jerry's very boldly came out supporting Black Lives Matter. And that was something that pushed the envelope beyond other brands in their category and also within the Unilever world. When I talk to clients, what I've been hearing is that it's inspirational to them as opposed to, whoa, they went down a path that we can't go down.
The crises are making visible some of the issues that sustainability professionals have focused on for a long time. And I think that that's really a critical change. And certainly the work you do to make visible people who are struggling. Sometimes when you are confronted with the facts, you do wake up. And I think that's what's happened in the last 6 months for a lot of people.
What does it mean to be essential to the communities we work in? What does it mean to be essential to the customers and the suppliers that we work with? Making sure that when they were faced with a crisis, who are we in that moment? And thinking about kind of their long-term purpose in those communities. The investor speak for all of this is ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. And I think the social, in the past few years, we've talked about how the social has always been very nebulous, and companies were on their way to defining what that meant. And I think it's become more explicit with all of this. I heard from an investor say that recently, that, social is just about people, and this crisis has kind of helped to define how important that is and help crystallize the definition of what they're talking about.
The Business Roundtable was formed decades ago as a private little club for CEOs of big companies to lobby on behalf of this, idea of shareholder value. Now, last year, the Business Roundtable changed its mission to be about stakeholder value, so everybody has an equal seat at the table. The problem is, nobody knows how to run a company on behalf of stakeholders, because all of these CEOs have been trained in business school, and we've worked for decades driving shareholder value. That's what we know how to do.
Throughout 2020, we saw some companies start to focus a bit more on the needs of employees, so the balance of power may be shifting a bit.
I just finished Rebecca Henderson's book, Reimagining Capitalism. She tells the story of Mark Bertolini, who was the CEO at Aetna. He became aware, I think it's important that phrase, he became aware that many of his employees were struggling, and he increased wages. Now, an interesting piece of that is that he didn't know it. So how many executives, how many talent people, what do we really know about the people who work across our value chain? And this is becoming more and more a part of sustainability professionals' work. The farmers, the producers, the questions about gig workers, the contract workers. These questions are coming up, but there's so much more work to do. Our colleague Miguel Padro just wrote an article about capital markets and racism. One of the points he makes, which I find very compelling, is that when companies talk about raising wages, the market often goes crazy. It does not like to hear it. Well, that's a very bad dynamic that is not sustainable for people. And then I'll just finally say that we've gotten pretty good at financial disclosures for companies. But on the human capital front, we haven't learned how to really communicate even to the markets. Sometimes they have diversity metrics. They don't often disclose salaries. They don't disclose information about the contract worker. So there's just so much work to do in this domain. Young people, though we can't lay all of the responsibility for fixing this system on young people. Some of us old timers would like to do that, but they're expecting their employers to do their best, to go beyond doing their best, to really rethink what's possible and to live up to those commitments. And we know so much about unemployment, and it's just so scary. But talented people are in scarce supply in a lot of places, and companies are competing for that talent. And those people want to work for companies that they believe in.
I've seen some brands empowering teams in their companies to do what they want to do and what they think is right. One example is Google, which is such a huge and massive organization, obviously. Many different teams within Google have reached out to us about what they're trying to do, whether it's about Black Lives Matter or representation in their advertising or being in their community. And it seems that they've empowered many different teams to do different things that are meaningful for them. And it can take the shape of a local initiative. Companies
have a lot more power within local communities than I think they like to admit to or really let other people know about. They have revenue power in local areas. They have people power in local areas. They have access to the halls of power in local areas. So there is really an opportunity for companies of all sizes to have a real impact in their local areas, the change really needs to happen in local areas. You know, when you're talking about police forces, every police force is alike, but every police force is different. So if you want to make changes to your police force, you know, you've got to see how your police force operates in your community. That's a local issue, and that's exactly the kind of thing that local companies could lean in on, to say to local leaders, look, you know, we employ a lot of people, we do a lot of business here, let's get something like this done.
There's a lot of things where I think if the American public are watching it, it's going to be hard for the collective leadership to go back to a status quo, because
the status quo wasn't working.
The status quo wasn't working. You know, there's been a lot of things where, you know, they said, you know, you couldn't work from home. It wasn't possible. People are working from home. Mm-hmm. There's no money for a bailout. Well, you found all kinds of money for a bailout. There's no money for health care.
During this time when we were really trying to, you know, basically brace for the impact, we were, you know, working with a lot of different insurance companies, and social work was able to really like get, you know, patients who didn't need to be in the hospital out of the hospital. It was the fastest I've ever seen any of said entities in social work move. And I'm like, okay, well, if you can do this on a regular basis, then we can continue to do this in the future. We can't go back. I think we can raise the bar now. We know what you can do. You've shown us as a medical provider, we all want people to have insurance. It's good for them. It's good for us. It's good for everybody.
Although this is a terrible time, economically, you know, with health, with the protests, everything that's happening with, it's a terrible time, but it's also, I think, kind of like a moment for us to really start new values and start to reassess and really see how we want the country to move forward. I think there's more participation from different people in different areas, whether that's, you know, they're trying to change the way the health system works or the way the justice system works. Like there's more leadership, I think, that's going to arise from all of this.
So I was a U.S. history geek, and I majored in U.S. history, taught U.S. history for 6 years. So very proud of who we've been and who we can be. And I always had in my head that we were a country that recognized its mistakes and its problems and kept pressing forward. And we've lost that over the last many years. And so I hope that we're refinding it.